You know, we tend to think of science as this beacon of progress, right? A tool for understanding our world with pure objectivity. But what happens when that tool gets twisted? When it's used not to find the truth, but to justify ugly prejudices? What happens when the very authority of science is co-opted to build racial hierarchies?
Yeah, that question, it's right at the heart of a really dark and complex chapter of our history. So today, we're going to trace the origins and the evolution of what's known as scientific racism. It's basically an ideology that dressed up raw bigotry in the fancy robes of empirical fact. And believe me, the consequences of that are still echoing today. So let's just dive right in.
All right, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the racial question and where it came from. Then we'll get into the whole 19th century thing with skulls, stats, and hierarchy. After that, we'll look at the dark shadow of eugenics. And then a scientific reckoning, the folks who pushed back. And finally, we'll bring it all to the present day with the modern debate.
Okay, so let's get into our first section. We're talking about the 19th century and its obsession with, well, skulls, stats, and hierarchy. I mean, this was an era that was just captivated by classifying and measuring everything. And out of that came this disturbing new field. Its whole goal was to categorize humanity not by culture or language, but by biology. And in doing so, to create this rigid, ugly ladder of human worth.
And right at the forefront of this whole movement was a physician from Philadelphia, a guy named Samuel George Morton. In 1839, he published this book, Crania Americana. And you gotta understand, this wasn't some fringe pamphlet nobody read. No, this thing was lavish, it was expensive, and it became profoundly influential. And its goal was pretty blunt, to prove that human races were totally distinct and unequal.
So how did he do it? How did Morton build this case? Well, he got his hands on this massive collection of human skulls from all over the world, and then he started measuring them, specifically their cranial capacity. His argument was simple and dangerous. A bigger skull means a bigger brain, and a bigger brain means superior intelligence. To make it all look super legitimate, he used this new printing technique, lithography, to create these incredibly detailed, almost eerily lifelike illustrations. It just screamed scientific credibility. But of course, his data, it was all manipulated to fit what he already believed. Surprise, surprise. He consistently found that white Europeans had the biggest skulls, then came Asians, then Native Americans, and right at the very bottom, black people.
And this just perfectly shows you the real agenda, doesn't it? Morton's so-called objective measurements were always paired with these totally subjective, racist conclusions. See, he wasn't just measuring bones. He was passing judgment on entire groups of people, claiming their character, their very potential, was biologically fixed and, well, inferior. And the timing of this quote about Native Americans, it was published right when the US government was forcibly kicking tribes off their ancestral lands. Morton's science provided the perfect, convenient justification for it all.
And here's the really crucial point. Back then, this was not seen as pseudoscience at all. Crania Americana was a sensation. It was being read all across Europe. It was praised by the founding fathers of anthropology. Heck, even Charles Darwin cited it as an authority. It basically kicked off a whole genre of similar books, with scientists in other countries rushing to measure and rank their own people. Morton had done it. He'd successfully packaged raw prejudice as cutting-edge science.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit into the late 19th and early 20th centuries to see how these ideas evolved. Because the concepts Morton pioneered, they didn't just stay tucked away in dusty academic books. Oh no, they mutated into something much more powerful and frankly terrifying, a full-blown social and political movement called eugenics.
So, the term eugenics, it literally means good birth. It was coined by a guy named Francis Galton, who was a brilliant statistician and, get this, Charles Darwin's cousin. What Galton did was he took Darwin's ideas about natural selection in animals and just, boom, applied them directly to human society. He basically argued that, hey, just like we breed better horses or dogs, we could and should breed better humans. How? By encouraging the fit to have kids and stopping the unfit from doing the same.
So you're probably asking, who did Galton think was fit and unfit? Well, his beliefs were crystal clear, and they were deeply, deeply racist. He used all his fancy statistical methods to create these hierarchies of intelligence and ability, and guess who was at the top? His own Anglo-Saxon race. And he flat out argued that black people were biologically and permanently inferior.
And these ideas, they found really fertile ground over in the United States. And here's the thing. In the US, eugenics wasn't championed by some fringe extremists. It was pushed by the educated elite.
A really key figure here was a man named Madison Grant, a wealthy lawyer, a well-known conservationist, even a friend of President Teddy Roosevelt. He wrote this best-selling book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, and in it he was basically sounding the alarm, warning that the superior Nordic race was being diluted and swamped by inferior races coming in through immigration.
And this quote from Grant, man, it just perfectly captures the core fear that was driving this whole movement. It wasn't just about promoting good stock, it was about this deep, deep terror of racial mixing. They truly believed it would lead to the degeneration and collapse of civilization. For these guys, heredity was everything. Your environment, your education, it meant almost nothing. Grant himself said, speaking English, wearing good clothes, and going to school does not transform a Negro into a white man. That's how fixed they thought these things were.
And this wasn't just talk in some book. No, these ideas got translated into brutal, real-world public policy. From the early 1900s all the way into the 1970s, over 30 U.S. states passed laws allowing for the forced sterilization of people they deemed unfit. The targets were often poor, disabled, or mentally ill, but they were also disproportionately people of color. And the number is just staggering. Around 60,000 Americans were sterilized against their will.
And it gets worse. This horrifying practice was given the official stamp of approval from the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. In 1927, in a case called Buck v. Bell, the court ruled that state-sponsored forced sterilization was completely constitutional. This quote from the famous Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., "3 generations of imbeciles are enough," is just so chilling. It shows you just how deep this eugenic logic had seeped into the very highest levels of the American establishment.
And this is where the story takes its absolute most sinister turn. The eugenics movement in America became a direct inspiration for the Nazis in Germany. Hitler's regime literally studied American policies. A leading American eugenicist actually drafted a model sterilization law that was then used as a blueprint in Germany. Think about that. The racial hygiene policies that led to the Holocaust, they didn't just spring out of nowhere. They were built in part on a foundation of so-called scientific ideas that had been pioneered and made legitimate right here in the US and in Britain.
But, and this is so important to remember, these toxic ideas did not go unopposed, not at all. Even while scientific racism was at the peak of its power, a really strong counter-narrative was starting to form. It was championed by activists and also by a new generation of scientists who were determined to dismantle the very racial hierarchies their predecessors had worked so hard to build.
Way before scientists started to push back, you had these powerful individuals who defied these racist ideas just by being who they were. Take Frederick Douglass. Here's a man who escaped slavery and became one of the most brilliant writers and speakers of the entire 19th century. Abolitionists called him a living refutation of the whole pro-slavery argument. I mean, his eloquence, his sheer intellect, it was so profound that he just single-handedly demolished those racist caricatures of black inferiority.
By the early 20th century, a full-on scientific rebellion was underway, led by this really influential anthropologist named Franz Boas. He and his students, they challenged the core ideas of scientific racism head-on. You can see the contrast here. They came up with this radical alternative. They argued that race itself isn't some fixed biological thing, but actually a fluid social construct. Boas did these groundbreaking studies on immigrant families and showed that skull shapes, the very foundation of Morton's entire theory, actually changed in a single generation based on their new environment in America. That just completely undermined the idea of fixed racial traits. They shifted the whole conversation away from skulls and genes and onto culture, history, and opportunity. They basically laid the scientific groundwork for how we understand race today.
So after the absolute horrors of World War II came to light, scientific racism was pretty much discredited in the mainstream. But the core idea behind it, the belief that our abilities, our personalities, our destinies are all just written in our biology, that has never fully gone away. It keeps popping up, even in modern debates.
Today, we call this idea biological essentialism. And all it really is the belief that the groups we belong to, whether it's race, sex, whatever, have some kind of underlying, unchangeable essence that determines who we are. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It's the exact same fundamental logic that powered Morton's skull measurements and Madison Grant's eugenics.
And the debate over this is very, very much alive today. So one perspective, which you can see in this quote from a recent discussion, basically asks, why are we so resistant to applying biology to ourselves? The argument goes something like this. We have no problem accepting that biology drives behavior in, say, dogs or birds, so why do we insist that humans are some kind of special exception? This point of view suggests that maybe our rejection of it is a kind of narcissistic injury.
Our ego just refusing to accept that we're fundamentally biological creatures. But then there's a really powerful counterargument from that exact same discussion that sees things completely differently. This perspective points right back to the history we've just been talking about. It argues that biological essentialism has pretty much always been a pseudoscience used to justify whatever the current social order is. From this viewpoint, it's just a tool, used over and over again to make artificial things like racial hierarchies or strict gender roles seem natural and inevitable. And look, this is not just some abstract academic debate. Not at all. These ideas have huge, real-world consequences. Arguments that are rooted in biological essentialism pop up all the time in policy debates about immigration, about education, about criminal justice, you name it. They shape how we think about gender and identity. And that's why digging into this history is so important. It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions about science and society, and it reminds us to always be vigilant about how data can be used and misused to prop up an ideology.
At the end of the day, the tainted legacy of scientific racism is just a stark, powerful reminder of something really important. Science is an incredibly powerful tool. There's no doubt about it. But it's only as objective and only as humane as the people using it. So the real takeaway, the challenge for all of us, is to stay critical, to always question assumptions, and to make absolutely sure that our search for knowledge is always guided by a deep commitment to the dignity and equality of every single person.